Hey nerds, just Jamie here with
your friend Claude.
And this is Nerd Bomber vs. Movies, the show where two movies fight and we pick a winner. Two things we always like to mention. One, the rubric. We have a system for scoring. We try to be objective. We try not to be subjective. We keep it professional around here.
That's right.
Second, we don't show the movies. Too expensive. We'll show you a clip, maybe a trailer, but we encourage everybody to go find these movies and watch them for themselves. Let us know what you think. All right, today's movies, we have two that feature accidental science fiction adventures of American youths. One a child, the other a teenager. They are 1984's The Last Starfighter. It's kind of right in there. And 1986's Flight of the Navigator. I wasn't sold on this combo at first when Claude mentioned it, but once I thought about it, I started to see the connections. We'll see upon fresh viewings how strong those connections are. Maybe we'll talk about that when we do some of the scoring later. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about some basics. First up, like I said, The Last Starfighter, released in 1984. The movie was written by Jonathan R. Betuel, not really sure. Not a big filmography here. He wrote this in addition to writing and directing a film called My Science Project in 1985, which was another kind of teens fine alien tech movie. And then 10 years later, he would write and direct the infamous Whoopi Goldberg movie Theodore Rex. There were also a couple episodes of TV shows mixed in, and that's really about it. Director duties here are handled by Nick Castle. Now, after this, Castle also directed some 90s comedies like Dennis the Menace and Major Payne. But before Starfighter is where things get interesting. He co-wrote Escape from New York, first of all. And before that, he actually got a start in the movies playing Michael Myers / The Shape in the early Halloween movies. So, kind of a John Carpenter start there. All right, the actors. Lance Guest stars as Alex Rogan, the disgruntled American teen / rookie spaceship pilot. Guest is best known for this role. He's been busy doing sort of one episode of every TV show through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and he also did a lot of low-budget movies like Jaws the Revenge and Mach 2. Dan O'Hurley is here as reptilian spaceship pilot Grigg. O'Hurley goes way back in Hollywood, but most genre movie fans would know him as the old man, the CEO of OCP in RoboCop. Robert Preston plays Centauri. In his last role here, the fast-talking con-man type character was a nod to what he's best known for, which was the part of Professor Harold Hill in The Music Man. And then finally, Catherine Mary Stewart plays Maggie Gordon, Alex's earthbound love interest. She doesn't have a ton to do in this movie, but she's had a pretty fun career. She's been in movies like Night of the Comet, Night Hawks, Night Flyers, and Weekend at Bernie's, among a lot of other stuff. That's pretty much it for the main cast. Keep an eye out for Star Trek and Stand By Me's Will Wheaton in the background because his dialogue was cut.
Shut up, Wes.
The Last Starfighter is most well known for being one of the earliest films to utilize CGI. It features an astronomical, for the time, 27 minutes or 300 shots of CG effects with fully rendered polygonal models that were, and this is the important part, fully animated. That separates it from something like Tron, which used computer-generated images, but the animations were still accomplished by capturing the still images optically. The effects here were done by Digital Productions, super creative name for a special effects studio, on a Cray X MP supercomputer, which was 6 feet by 8 feet and weighed over 5 tons. It was the 80s. Okay, let's talk pop culture footprint. All the regular stuff for this type of movie is here. There were comics, there were tabletop games, there were books. 20 years later, believe it or not, there was an off-Broadway musical, which is a little bit strange. And if you know anything about this film, you might be wondering about video games. After all, the movie has an on-the-nose video game influence. Well, it did have video game adaptations, but they are all unreleased. Atari never finished the arcade game seen in the movie that they promised to in the credits, and various other versions for Atari 2600, 8-bit home computers, and the Nintendo never came to fruition or were eventually released under different names like Star Raiders 2, Solaris, or Uridium. So, why were they never released? Unfortunately, it became obvious early on that the movie would not be a financial success. You'll see that in a little bit. Nevertheless, its pioneering forays into CGI ensures that it has both its cult following and its place in cinematic history. All right, next up is 1986's Flight of the Navigator. Writers here are Michael Burton and Matt Mcmanus. They're mostly known for this movie, definitely the respective peak accomplishments for these two guys. They haven't really done much else of note, to be honest. Mcmanus has directed a lot of music videos, the Thomas Jane Punisher short Dirty Laundry, which was fun, and a Rock the Dwayne Johnson football movie, Gridiron Gang. Directing here is Randall Kleiser. He had an interesting directing career. It actually includes Grease, Blue Lagoon, White Fang, and Big Top Pee-wee. You'll see a Big Top Pee-wee connection in a little bit. Okay, casting. Starring ahead of such candidates as Joaquin Phoenix and Chris O'Donnell, as confused 12-year-old adventurer David Freeman is Joey Kramer, not the drummer. He didn't do a lot other than this. He was in Clan of the Cave Bear, but was essentially not active for over 20 years. He did show up in weirdo indie sci-fi film Fried Berry in 2020. Next up, credited as Paul Mall in the role of Max the Spaceship AI, is none other than Paul Rubens. Do we have to say who Paul Rubens is?
Shouldn't have to.
He's Pee-wee Effin' Herman, of course, so now you see the connection. Moving on, David's parents are played by Cliff DeYoung and Veronica Cartwright. DeYoung is best known probably for this, and Cartwright is best known as Lambert in the first Alien movie. In the role of ethically questionable Dr. Faraday is Howard Hessman, best known for WKRP in Cincinnati. And finally, as ethically pure NASA intern Carolyn McAdams is Sarah Jessica Parker of Sex and the City and Hocus Pocus and 100 other things. That's what she's known for, everything. Now, this film also has an important place in the lineage of CGI effects on film. It is the first time reflection mapping was used, and it was used to create the reflective surface on the simulated chrome-like surface of the ship. This was all handled by director's brother Jeff Kleiser, and it was matted onto the film one frame at a time because the computer didn't have enough memory to hold the frames after being used. This was done on a computer called the Foonly F1, the only Foonly F1. I don't know how big it was, but it's important because it was also used on Tron and Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. In addition to the significant steps taken in visual effects, it was also the first film to feature a film score of entirely electronic music composed by Alan Silvestri. Despite all of that, not a big budget or a big box office here, and not much in the way of a pop culture footprint at the time. No books, no comics, no video games, etc. There's strong nostalgia for it now, and that's evidenced by the upcoming remake that is currently in the pipeline. So those are the two movies. When we come back, we're going to have Claude, and we're going to have the big board for the tale of the tape. I said we'd have a big board, and I ain't no liar, so here it is, and here's Claude. Take it away.
This is the tale of the tape for Flight of the Navigator and The Last Starfighter. Two very similar, yet still kind of different, but ultimately very similar movies. And to back up that claim, let's take a look at the numbers involved for each one. Starting off with a non-numerical feature, the distributing studio, Universal for The Last Starfighter, and Disney, of course, for Flight of the Navigator. Moving down to the rating, it's the exact same, PG for both, kind of no surprises. These are movies that explore slightly emotional topics with a little more depth than your average G movie, but otherwise, probably be G stuff.
Pretty safe.
Running time, 101 minutes for Last Starfighter, 90 minutes on the dot for Flight of the Navigator. Neither one very long, but oddly enough, the pacing and the editing sort of don't really match up to the running time when you're watching them. Going down to release date, July 13th, 1984 for The Last Starfighter, August 1st, 1986 for Flight of the Navigator. Kind of in the same era. You can't be certain that one of them is a response to the other one, but, this was a time period where space and computers and video games and all these themes were running rampant.
Mm-hmm.
Budget-wise, this is kind of where it gets interesting, as is usual on this show. $15 million for Last Starfighter, and again, they sort of had somewhat cutting-edge approach to their effects. Certainly a very unique approach in movie history, and you can kind of see where that budget would have come into play. Made back basically double its budget, $29 million. And oddly enough, it's the exact same story for Flight of the Navigator. $9 million budget, making back double the amount, $18.5 million. It's surprising through my memories of Flight of the Navigator. I hadn't seen Last Starfighter until this show, but Flight of the Navigator seemed like a much bigger deal production in my mind's eye. And to kind of look at the numbers involved, it's a surprise. And I think that just speaks to how much they were able to do and get out of that budget.
Agreed. So there you have it, the tale of the tape. We're off for some adventures through space and time with the youth of the 80s. And when we return, we'll have some scores. All right, we're back with our first set of scores for The Last Starfighter. Looks like I'm up first. Here we go. Turn to the crowd. There you can see it. Visuals, I'm giving it a 7. It's a pretty high score. The effects, it's not as though the effects hold up in terms of their realism, but they really put them on display. My memory of this movie was that maybe the effects were not, the CGI effects specifically, were not front and center, not featured as much as they are, but they really don't hold back. They show the ships, they show the fighting in space, there are background graphics, there's a lot of stuff going on. But aside just the special effects, which is what this movie is mostly known for, really fun costumes, really good special effects makeup, and an honest look at what the 80s looked like. Not everything is neon drenched. It's the dim 80s that was actually the real 80s, which makes sense because it was actually made at that time.
Right.
So pretty high score there, 7. That's pretty good. Performances, 6. Mostly just kind of standard performances happening here. Everybody has some fun things to do. The character of Centauri is kind of a fun, fast-talking car salesman type, which is good. Hurley, in the role of Grig, is doing a lot of fun stuff, especially with all the makeup on his face. He's doing some fun things there. And Guest is also, he gets to have some fun because there's an element of the movie where he plays the synthesoid version of himself, the robot version of the character. And he's got some fun moments there where he's trying to figure out how to really act like the human version that he's trying to copy. So there's some bright spots, but it's just kind of standard work most of the way. Nothing wrong with it. Everybody's doing what they have to do. Everybody's accomplishing their task with some fun high spots along the way. Writing, 6. Again, there's some high spots here. The movie is very ambitious, especially. It's getting high marks for writing in terms of its plot and storyline, and its willingness to really do something ambitious with a limited budget and very lofty goals, obviously, with what this movie was trying to do. For the most part, I think it pulls it off. The dialogue is not necessarily smooth. It can be a little bit clunky. Some of the performances kind of help that move along. And generally speaking, the movie is constructed in a way that kind of zips right along. You don't feel like it's overstaying its welcome. It's over 100 minutes. It's very palatable, very watchable, very solid. So 7, 6, and 6 is my board. How about yours?
Mine looks like this. Starting off with the visuals, I give it an 8 because taking the comprehensive weight of everything into effect. Visual effects are kind of its bread and butter, and they stick out the most because they're the most unique, they're the most basically innovative, and they really take a kind of a risk by early computer animating everything. There's not really a lot. I mean, it seems like there's some model work in this for certain shots, maybe towards the end when the ship lands and things like that. But for the most part, like all the space travel and battle scenes are kind of purely early CGI. And because of the subject matter and the story and the concept of the movie, I think they get away with it for the most part. In a different setting, it would look a little cheaper, but I think it's cool to see this, and it stands out among other movies of the time. Makeup and costumes are also really impressive. From what I had heard about this before I actually saw it, and my impression of it based on still photos and whatever, I expected it to be really laughable. And it was really fairly respectable, actually. So high marks for that. Moving into performances, I gotta go 6.5 because, again, there's no award winners, as I often say. There's no impressive dramatic turns in this, but there is, among the kind of mediocre baseline performances, there's some nice moments, and some of those standouts actually for me, besides like the main cast elements that you mentioned, were some of the background players. The little brother in this sticks out for me because he's a fairly realistic 80s little brother.
That's true.
And 80s kid in general. He gets to swear liberally throughout this PG movie. He gets to read Playboys. I mean, he appears to be, 8 to 10 years old?
Yeah, yeah.
And you wouldn't see kids realistically depicted like that in a more modern movie, I think. But we were all doing it back then. Also, I made a comment when we were watching this about the black neighbor character, who basically is pre-Samuel L. Jackson.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny when you watch this. You'd be like, oh, that's who should be playing this part. And basically every movie from here on out, it was. Also, some of the old ladies and the members of the trailer park in the movie are kind of fun background players. Some really amusing character moments.
The old lady with the shotgun is the only one that had any sense.
Right. Moving over to writing, I have to drop down quite a bit for me. The story itself, the concept behind the movie is really solid, really strong. You know, it takes off on the video game craze of the 80s and actually makes sort of an ambitious story about it. But the execution leaves some to be desired for me, and some of that is the way the script is laid out. Some of it's the editing. I'm just going to lump that all in with the writing. There's a bunch of parts where it slows down for me, where I feel like it could have been tighter or more focused. Towards the third act, the beginning of the third act, it gets a little hard to follow for me, a little convoluted. Some of the exposition for how the spaceship works and going into the battle and how that's all set up, I felt like it could have just been simplified.
You mentioned it was like the tutorial of a video game.
Right.
It's funny because this was really before that sort of thing was actually happening in video games, 1984. But it did very much feel that way.
Yeah.
Here's how you turn, and here's how you toggle, and here's how the controls work. 100%.
Maybe that was the only way to get the point across, and it worked so well in this movie that every actual video game has copied it ever since. But when you're actually watching and trying to follow along, some of it just gets a little mechanical. So, in summation, my scores for The Last Starfighter are 8, 6.5, and 5.
So there you have it. 2 sets of scores. More scoring to come. All right, we're back with more scores, and this time, Claude, I believe you are up to go first.
Well, let's navigate the flight. My scores are as follows. Visuals, also strong, not quite as strong for me, because there isn't as much going on visually that you can point to as an effect or anything that jumps out at you. Still 7, but obviously everything visual in this movie is centered around the spaceship and the alien inhabitants that you see on board, and just the design of that set. It's enough to be really memorable, really have a fairly decent pop culture impact, probably more in its day, but I mean even now, I don't know that I could go as far as saying iconic, but it stops just short, I think. Mm-hmm. It's a very cool design, it's a very cool concept, especially if you're watching this as a kid. Obviously, who doesn't want that experience, you know what I mean? And one of the biggest oversights I've always thought was that, at least to my knowledge, none of the Disney parks offer a simulated Flight of the Navigator experience.
Oh, yeah. That's an oversight for sure.
I mean, you get the Star Tours, you get, you have the Captain EO thing, the Michael Jackson take you through space ride, which is, fun for what it was. But, I mean, this is you see it in the movie, you should be able to step right into it. Mm-hmm. As a kid, for me, I just thought the way the stairs come out as these little floating discs or whatever was just so cool. Yeah, like I said, other than that, they do good sets, and NASA equipment is convincing. There are some other little robots that move around there and stuff like that, but again, it's all about the spaceship. Performances. This movie doesn't give a lot of opportunity for broad performances, for elaborate performances. Again, it focuses on the child star and Paul Rubens as the alien Max. He's the pilot of the ship, or is the ship itself?
Yeah.
Hard to really figure that out, but again, that's part of the appeal. And those performances are really good. Like you said, Joey Kramer kind of beat out other names that they weren't names then, but
Sure.
we know that they are fairly gifted and or competent actors. And I mean, he did an admirable job, especially when it came to time to emote. Very, very convincing. And again, Paul Reubens is kind of who he is, and you know what he brings to the party. Writing 6.5. It's tighter overall. It's a little more coherent, I thought, in The Last Starfighter. But again, it doesn't. It's not immune to the problem of being convoluted in certain spots.
Yeah.
There's some plot elements involving time jumps and things like that do get a little hard to follow. Even for a kids movie, it still takes me a couple watches to really kind of absorb it. But overall, still very solid scores. And I've seen this a lot. And going into it today, these scores kind of reflect how I've always felt about it. So 7, 6, 6.5.
All right, my turn. Here's my board for Flight of the Navigator. Visuals, we're staying at 7 here. You had a little bit of a downgrade. I stayed equal.
Yeah.
Still impressive CGI special effects. I mentioned in the intro that this movie is also important in the sort of the evolution of CG in film for its own unique reasons. Not only did it do an early version of morphing, but as I said earlier, it did that reflection mapping, which nobody had ever done anything like that either. But in addition to that, to compare it to the other movie, The Last Starfighter, the effects are pretty equal, if not shown quite as much. Some of the set dressing is not quite as interesting, but I think it gets a bump because it did more in the way of, puppeteering and animatronics.
Yeah.
That the Last Starfighter didn't really feature. So yes, you're right. The menagerie of creatures and Max, like you said, the pilot / living ship / AI, intelligence.
All the above.
Yes, is really sort of on display here.
Yeah.
So I agree with that much. Just I don't give it I'm not marking it down lower than the other film due to the less sort of in-your-face special effects nonstop. I think what they have is still effective, and there are other elements that help balance out what it lacks. Performances, I go 5.5 here, but my feelings are very similar to yours. Most everybody in this movie is, again, just kind of doing standard stuff. There's not a lot of opportunity for anything too special. You have a very competent child actor, which is sometimes hard to come by.
Yeah.
And Paul Reubens is having a lot of fun doing a vocal performance here. In a time period where was he coming up on, was he Pee-wee by 1986?
There were some HBO specials and live shows.
He was starting to get into an age where he was sort of living the gimmick, so to speak, as Pee-wee.
Well, he does the voice in this.
Yeah.
A little bit.
So, but he's still getting to have a little bit of fun outside of that character, and I think he does great. But like I said, there's not a lot of other really interesting performances going on. So 5.5, which shouldn't be misunderstood as a bad score, but it's just a very sort of standard score. And I have a similar score, or the exact same score, 5.5 for writing. Again, I agree with you. I think that the dialogue mostly is fine, and Paul Reubens is having a lot of fun with what he does. I think the plot is a little bit clunky. You mentioned some issues with the time jumping. There's, without giving spoilers away for a movie that's nearly 40 years old, there is like an immediate time jump at the beginning of the movie that then sets off the plot for the rest of the movie that then they have to come back to at the end. It's a little bit convoluted, I think. Yep. So a little bit of a downgrade for that. But again, 5.5 shouldn't be misunderstood as a bad score. So because I enjoyed both of these movies.
For sure.
So there is my board. There's my scoring. There is my scoring for the Flight of the Navigator. We're going to be back. We're going to get the big board out. And we're going to do some final tabulations in just a moment. All right, we're back, and so is the big board, and there you can see the final score. The Last Starfighter taking the win, 6.42 to 6.25 for the Flight of the Navigator. I think that this might be the scores are close, but I think that this might be the most surprising win that we've had on the show.
Right up there if it's not.
Yeah.
Certainly the most evenly matched, I think, between any two movies we've done.
That's pretty true. We've had some other close scores. We did a little research on our past scoring just to see kind of where this sits in terms of, again, not so much the raw scores, because there's a difference between, this is why we talk about the rubric. There's a difference in how we score things in the numbers based on our instinct. There are movies we've scored with higher numbers that I would not watch before I would choose to watch these.
Yeah.
The reason we use the rubrics is to stay away from that sort of emotional instinct and really break it down into the elements of a movie. And so this is what you get. But nevertheless, I really enjoy both of these movies. I recommend them both. I think the winner here, even me, like, again, instinctually, I'd probably say I like The Last Starfighter more. I would have thought that in terms of technical filmmaking that Flight of the Navigator would come out with the win. And I'm pretty sure I know that you felt that way.
Yeah.
But here we are with The Last Starfighter victory.
Yeah, before today, and I still stand by it. Overall, I think I summed it up with Flight of the Navigator is, from a filmmaking standpoint, a better movie. But The Last Starfighter is more entertaining as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're seeing is that translate into, an edge with a few numbers.
It's a tight victory. It's a surprising win, but a close call nevertheless.
Right.
All right. Well, I guess that does it for this episode of Nerd Bomber vs. Movies. You can find us right here on YouTube. Obviously, you already have. We have a podcast called the Nerd Bomber Podcast, and the easiest place to find that and links to all the stuff we do is on Instagram at NerdBomberPod. That said, I've been Just Jamie. He's been your friend Claude. And until the next battle,
aloha.
Please deposit litter in trash receptacles as you exit the auditorium. The perfect gift for any occasion, gift certificates are available at the box office. Thanks for visiting with us. Buckle up and drive safely. See you next week.